Aloha, everyone, and welcome. My name is Trustee Chair, and I am the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. The Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs was established 2 years ago with the support of congressional funding, and we focus on security issues broadly defined in the Indo-Pacific region. So today we're so delighted to host an event on the securitization of clean technology, and it's co-sponsored by the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs, the Center for Chinese Studies, and the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our speaker today will be Dr. Ilaria Mazzocco, and she is a senior fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She has over a decade of experience researching industrial policy, Chinese climate policy, and the intersection between the energy transition and economic and national security. She was previously a senior research associate at the Paulson Institute, where she led research on Chinese climate and energy policy for Macropolo. So she's going to present for approximately 35 minutes today, and then we will have a discussion that will be moderated by Dr. Eric Harwit, who is a professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dr. Harwit has a lot of great research on China, and he's recently focused on topics including China's 5G mobile equipment production, mobile social media, and electric car market and vehicle production. So we're so pleased to have you with us today for this presentation and for the discussion, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions after the presentation. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Mazzocco for her presentation.
Thank you so much. Let me share my presentation and let me say I'm so pleased. I could only be more pleased if you had actually invited me to join you in Hawaii, but maybe next time. I'm actually in Washington, D.C., so this is great for me as a way for me also to, I think, share more broadly sort of feelings and the discussions here in Washington and how this is affecting more broadly, I think, climate policy in a variety of different spaces. I was just recently in California, and of course, there some of the discussions on relations with China and climate change are actually quite different. So I'm looking forward also to receiving your questions from the public because I'm sure I'll be learning from you all as well. Just for a little bit of background before I start, what I'm going to be talking about today is the trajectory and the drivers of the current conflict that is emerging over clean tech. This is a conflict that has to do a lot with trade, but also increasingly national security, and it has very direct implications for the investments that have been made in manufacturing in the United States, as well as climate policy and the climate agenda that the Biden administration has brought forward, as well as more broadly also, relations with China, but also the global South. So a lot of different topics. I'm going to try and bring these strands together, but again, I welcome questions that might, I might not be able to get to everything. And so if there's any loose strands, I'm very happy to get back to them in the Q&A. So just for a start, I think I'll be talking about clean tech, and by clean tech here, I really some of the key industries that are part of this are solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, to a certain extent, but much less wind turbines. But more generally, China has for decades had a deflationary effect on the global markets. But essentially, things made in China are cheap. This has made consumers all over the world pretty happy, and China continues to have that effect, even as other countries have actually had more inflationary pressures, and their goods, manufactured goods, have become more expensive. So this is the actual sort of price index of imports into the United States, right? So it's goods made, for example, in the European Union that are imported into the United States. You can see that Chinese goods are clearly quite competitive, even compared to Mexico. Now, this comes at a time when clean tech products, and you see here, this is lithium batteries, PV panels, EVs, wind very small, but wind here is only wind generating kits. We can talk more about the complexity of tracing wind exports, actually. But just those three industries are 4.2%, 4.25% if you add wind generating sets. This is why these industries are called the three new in China. So these have become now recognized officially as new drivers of growth in the Chinese economy. And they've become 4.25% of exports from China in 2023. By comparison, in 2019, they were 1.5%. Now, what does it mean to be 4.25% of Chinese exports? Well, if you compare it with something as strategic and important as steel, iron, and steel and iron related articles, which of course, China being the largest producer of steel globally, that was 4.9% in 2023 for China. So you can see that clean tech is getting up there in terms of importance. It is becoming a pretty important industry globally. So that's just to say this is important for China. Of course, we know that it's important globally because the reason why they're exporting so much is that there's a very significant demand. And more significantly, China is very important in the supply chain across a variety of different sectors, right? So this actually includes electrolyzers and heat pumps as well. I stole this from the International Energy Agency's Global Energy Outlook. And what it shows here is that, these are forecasts, obviously, so might be different. But, what it shows is that, yes, there are all these diversification policies in the United States, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act that are in place. Yes, they're going to have an impact. But China is going to continue to be pretty important because it is so important. And this is across the whole value chain. So, and we could talk more about exactly what this means. But essentially, when you're talking about solar PV, it's from polysilicon all the way to the panel. From wind, it's, from the all the components, which are there's a very large number of components in wind turbines. Batteries, from the refining of the minerals, because of course, China is not necessarily always home to all these minerals, especially if you're thinking of something like lithium, but a lot of refining happens in China. Refining cathodes, anodes, and then actual battery cells and battery assembly. And then, electrolyzers and heat pumps, of course, are less used today. So these are very much, of course, heat pumps are being used more and more in Europe. Electrolyzers are a little early stage, but obviously these are considered technologies of the future. Now, all of this is to say that I think right now, this year especially, a few trends have really come into into focus. And I see here I wrote 3 trends, but I didn't put them into 3 categories, but I'll get to it, don't worry. So the first is that exports are growing from China. Right. And they're growing because of domestic drivers. For example, in the case of EVs, there's very clearly a price war, but similar trends are visible in the solar industry. There is increasing discussion of overcapacity, that being, that factories in China can produce more products that are actually that can serve the domestic market. And so there's fears of dumping of those exports elsewhere. There's evidence of potentially some of that happening in the solar industry, a little more fraught, I would say, in the data, a little more complicated in the case of cars, but certainly there's been a lot of discussions of that. A lot of competition. If you actually go and look at it, most of these, especially visible in the EV sector, which we'll be focusing on in just a minute, there's a lot of producers of electric vehicles in China. So actually, if you're a Chinese company that produces solar or EVs or batteries, your best chance is to go out, because whatever market you go to is going to be less competitive than the Chinese market. This is a little counterintuitive, I think, for some people, because of the fact that we all know that there are also significant subsidies. Industrial policy is quite significant. Now, there are also significant international drivers. These products are in high demand. And up until recently, at least, the supply abroad was actually quite limited. Now there have been a lot of investments, but if you want to buy a low-cost solar panel or battery EV, a lot of times you're buying from Chinese companies, essentially. There's again, limited supply of production abroad, even though now there's many more investments, and it will be more significant in the future. Now, The other interesting trend, I think one that is a little less understood, is that these Chinese companies are not just producing in China, but increasingly they're starting to set up production abroad. So why are they doing so? I think part of it is still that competition element. And the other is that, going abroad and setting up and entering new markets can really provide an advantage. And there is a diversification effort. These companies do understand that there are some risks in China, and there is some geopolitical risk in being a Chinese company, right? So they're quite aware of this and they're responding to this. Now, the third trend, which here you see in the slide got kind of conflated, is that these companies are in fact reacting to what are increasing trends abroad. So other countries are actively enacting de-risking policies, what I call it de-risking policies. Now these take the form of, for example, the Inflation Reduction, tax credits, requirements for entity of concern, that sort of thing that is happening in the United States. And a variety of new investigations that the European Union has launched into subsidization of Chinese companies. But also that many countries are actually they're trying to attract more of that Chinese investment. So you see that there's that push and pull element where on the one hand, they need to diversify because that way they can comply with de-risking policies. And when they're doing so, they find that there's plenty of countries that are quite happy to welcome them. And you can see very good examples of this in Thailand, in Brazil, but actually increasingly also in Europe. And there's some very interesting cases developing right now in Europe. Certainly Hungary has been at the forefront of welcoming Chinese foreign direct investment, but you see countries in Southern Europe, like Spain and Italy, actually positioning themselves to attract more investment as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Chinese market. And forgive me, I feel that it's important to just go over this a little bit. So if people are extremely familiar with this, just forgive me, but I will be quite quick. I just think it is important because there's been a lot of talk about, the slow Chinese market is a driver for these companies going abroad. And yes, that is true. It has been a bit of a disappointment compared to expectations, but when you look at it, it's still pretty significant. It's still a pretty large market and it has grown significantly. Now, to put that into context, this data is old. This is from 2021. But if you look at it today, it's even more, it's that same trend essentially. And so if you look at the vehicle stock, so cars on the roads essentially, about half of them, a little bit less than half of them are in China. So that's pretty important. It is by far the largest EV market in the world. Europe comes after that. And when you look at sales, again, this is about a year old. No, a little bit less than a year old, but I have the updated data. So if you look at what share of, the EV share of all new EV vehicle sales, right? So how many EVs as a percentage of all automotive sales? In China, in 2023, it was 35%. And actually in March, it hit over 40% in March of this year. So that is, it may be disappointing, but it's quite significant. The US is around 8%. So it's picking up, but you can see that the United States is really a laggard compared to many other parts of the world. And that's just, I think, something to keep in mind when we're in the United States and may not be as aware of just how far electrification has come in China and why so many of these Chinese companies actually have quite a good track record. They already have millions of customers. And so that gives them a real advantage compared to some other companies when they go abroad. Now let's get to the meat of it, and that's the exports, right? And this has been central to the discussion here in Washington when it comes to economic competition with China. Secretary Yellen was just in Beijing, and this and solar panels were sort of at a key part of the discussion that was ongoing. You can see that EVs have become a pretty big driver of this boost in exports from China. Now China has become a major automotive exporter. It is rivaling Japan. I think it may have just surpassed Japan recently, but it's about similar. And you can see that this has been quite a recent trend. So China always exported cars, but never this many. So this has been a very rapid trend over the past I would say, couple of years, really, that continues to grow. I will note, if you look at it from a value perspective, it looks like EVs are almost half of all exports. When you look at it as a number of vehicles, actually internal combustion engine vehicles are still quite dominant. So what does this mean? It means that the average internal combustion engine vehicle that's exported from China is extremely cheap. So we don't always know exactly what kind of vehicles these are. In some cases, it might not even be, even though these are categorized as passenger vehicles, this is trade data. In some cases, it might not exactly be what you and I might think of as passenger vehicles. But that said, regardless, these are cheap vehicles, and actually I would note polluting vehicles as well. So this is actually a trend that from a climate perspective, one may want to watch, especially because, as we just said, that 45% to sales in China of EVs means that there's quite a few factories that may be lying idle or maybe producing now for the export market. And in many cases, those factories are actually jointly owned by foreign companies like GM, Ford, or Volkswagen. So I think that's just a trend that's been a little bit underreported, but I think it's going to be a more significant trend over the next year or so. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. Now, where are all these exports going? Well, mostly Europe. And that was about 56% of all exports from EV exports from China were going to Europe. But you see, Asia is really, I think, the story of 2023, picking up so dramatically, and will continue to pick up more significantly. Now, what I think is interesting about this is that a lot of the, if you go and look at the disaggregated data, I mean, part of the reason why Asia is so large, right? So this data includes, the data for Asia includes from Israel to Thailand to Uzbekistan, right? So it's a very varied region. I think that's part of what's so interesting about this. The narrative until recently was that EVs were really a developed world phenomenon that would then trickle down to the developing world. But we've seen now that with these very low-cost vehicles that Chinese manufacturers have been unafraid to try and market and export to countries that traditionally have not been considered maybe, particularly promising markets for electric vehicles, they've kind of changed that narrative. So you now see increasing pickup of in sales of EVs in countries that at the same time, in many cases, are also trying to develop their industry. So Thailand is a perfect example of this. Now, multiple Chinese companies are setting up factories in Thailand, but also sales of EVs in Thailand have grown very rapidly thanks to government policies that aim to expand that market. And of course, there seems to be it goes hand in hand with this idea that, well, there's going to be manufacturing, but also this is going to be good for the environment. Works very well for countries like Thailand that don't have established domestic manufacturers that might be displaced by this, right? And we'll get to Europe, where the challenges in the political economy realm is much more significant. Now, this is just a bit more the updated data. I want to see what it looked like. It's a little more confusing, right? You see these like nice smooth trends. That's because it's annual. If you look at it monthly, you see it varies a lot more significantly. But and there seems to be been a bit of a slowdown. But I think it shows that the red, which is Asia, is still looking like it's going to be a pretty significant. There's going to be probably pretty significant growth once we start looking at Q1 and Q2 for exports to this region. Now, Europe, you may have heard that there is an anti-subsidy investigation ongoing in Europe. This is looking into how subsidies may have distorted the market for EVs and benefited Chinese auto EV exports to Europe, and they are likely to lead to tariffs, essentially. Now, I thought this chart is extremely confusing, and I apologize. I just have not had the creativity to think of a better way to show this. But what it shows is the purple there, that negative side, that's how many cars Europe exports to China. Internal combustion engine vehicles exported from Europe and go to China. The red is how many EVs Europe sells to China. Pretty small, right? And then that light blue is EV exports from China to Europe. And you see how starting in 2020, they just have grown significantly. And so you see that line, the light blue line, that's the trade balance. And you see how it's getting very close to getting reversed. Now, why does the trade balance matter? This is trade balance for EVs. Oh, sorry, for cars, the car automotive sector. Why does Europe care about this? The automotive industry is really important to Europe. I think we think about it as being really important to the US. It's even more important for countries like Germany. It's just central to their manufacturing ecosystem. It employs a lot of people. It's quite significant. And from a European Union standpoint perspective, when they look at the broader trade balance, all those are actually what make a big difference. And so this line is quite threatening at a time in which Europe is not doing economically particularly well, unlike the United States, actually. And when a term that is often used in Europe is actually deindustrialization. So the fear is, actually you might get companies stop producing in Europe and they'll all be producing in China, exporting back to Europe. So this has been terrifying. So in September, we got an announcement from von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and this investigation is ongoing. So we don't know exactly where it's leading to, and I'm not going to get into the weeds here. I'm happy to answer the Q&A if this is particularly interesting. Why am I talking about the European Union, though? This is relevant for the United States because there's actually been a very close dialogue between the European Union and the United States on this. There's been there's been a lot of coordination at least a lot of awareness of this. And Washington is looking very closely at what's happening in Europe and at the implementation of these new trade defense tools that the European Union actually explicitly, in many cases, passed. And there's a variety of these tools to, bolster its economic security, but also, take a very close look at sort of what's happening on the climate side of things. Now, and I'll get back to how this compares to the United States in a couple of slides. But before I even got to that, I just wanted to get to exactly who is exporting from China. As you can see, and this has changed over time, the majority now is Chinese brands. So it's actually, right there, it's actually 59% because that medium blue American JVs, which is 2%, that is majority Chinese owned. That's the GM Wuling SAIC joint venture, of which GM is a minority shareholder. So although you can place it in American joint venture, this is a brand that Americans have never heard of. And it is essentially, I would argue much more of a Chinese brand. So that brings actually the Chinese brand's share of exports almost up to 60%. That said, Tesla remains the largest single exporter of EVs from China. Where are those EVs going? I do not have that data. If somebody has it, please share it with me. But we have pretty strong indications that it's mostly going to Europe. So actually, Tesla has been one of the companies that have been most concerned about this European investigation on subsidies. And we'll see exactly how it affects Tesla. There is one of the interesting things of this regulation is that different levels of subsidies could be set for different companies. Unclear if they'll do that or if they'll just use a blanket subsidy per country of origin. So it's quite interesting. I will note, that blue, that shades of blue segment, it is it's getting smaller. Still a lot of cars. And I think that's just something to keep in mind that when we're talking about exports of EVs from China, we're really not just talking about Chinese brands. Everybody talks about BYD, but it actually, GM has factories in China, Volkswagen has factories in China, BMW has factories in China, Tesla has factories in China. And so all those factories are actually assets that these companies may exploit when they decide to increase their production. Now, the United States. Actually, the US doesn't really have exports, doesn't really have Chinese-made EVs. It's quite small. I think it's about 2%. And my colleague, Ryan Featherston, ran the numbers. And, it's really, the numbers really seem to match the sales of Polestar in the United States. So that tells us that there's one company It's possible some people think they may be taking advantage of this tariff loophole where if you export a certain number of vehicles in a certain harmonized standard HS code category, you can import a certain number of cars in that same category. But it's unclear. We don't know if that's actually the case. The reason I say they may be doing this is because Polestar is part of the same group as Volvo, Geely. And Volvo has a factory in South Carolina, and actually Polestar is supposed to start producing this year. They're already prototyping vehicles there, and so that actually may mean that those numbers of those exports to the United States may even potentially go down. So that's an interesting trend to just keep in mind. But there are. Oops, looks like my slides are. Oh, well, they skipped. Yeah, okay. Apologies. Technology isn't always as smooth as we would like it to be. Now, there is a lot of talk these days about Mexico. Now, why is that? Well, there's two pathways here. So one is that you might have transshipment. So vehicles maybe get exported to Mexico and then somehow re-exported to the United States. They wouldn't necessarily qualify for the USMCA, the trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, because it actually has pretty strict country of origin and local content requirements. But the idea is that these may qualify for some kind of reduced tariff, right? So right now tariffs, and I should have said in this previous slide, one of the reasons why there aren't all these exports is that the U.S. has pretty high tariffs on EVs. So it's 27.5%. Now, so technically they could qualify for a 2% tariff, and so that'd be pretty good. We don't see a lot of evidence for this actually at this moment. Mexico does import quite a few vehicles and cars in general from China. But then if you look at that, that's a pretty small share of all the EVs that Mexico itself exports to the United States. And that's because Mexico is sort of a manufacturing base for automotive companies that operate in the United States, including American companies. But so I don't see a lot of evidence of actual transshipment. And it's a little different for batteries. So it is quite significant for batteries, and it is quite likely that those batteries are going into cars that are then shipped to the United States. And that's just because China is a major producer of batteries. Now, what is likely going to be happening in Mexico, and we see some of that trend already, is that trend I mentioned earlier. So companies are starting to look at countries where they can set up actual factories and produce cars for new markets. And BYD, for example, is now exploring the option to open a factory in Mexico. There's a lot of concern about that in Washington, and that would be because if they were producing in Mexico, then it would be fairly easy to enter the United States market with a lower tariff. BYD says it's not interested in the U.S. market; it's interested in the local Mexican market. I'm sure to a certain extent they are, but I would imagine that pretty large automotive market just north of the border would be quite attractive as well. What is interesting is that, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't the trend that's limited to Mexico. This is just BYD. I have the data for other companies as well. BYD is obviously the largest, so I think it's the most interesting in some ways. Chinese companies are setting up factories around the world because they want to enter new markets and they want to produce locally. And they're doing so also because countries, as I mentioned, are trying to attract more of that manufacturing investment. Mexico is no exception. Right. So there's actual interest in having more manufacturing. Mexico has been a big beneficiary of de-risking policies because it's been getting a lot of sort of nearshoring investment, and BYD is looking to be part of that. So I think that's going to complicate things significantly for the United States when Washington goes to Mexico City or Bangkok or, Santiago and says, you shouldn't accept these kinds of investments because we don't particularly like it, or we think it's a national security risk. So I think that's going to be some tough conversations that are going to be happening between Mexico and the United States. And there's already talks of renegotiating of trade agreements or including quotas on Chinese content, etc. So that's definitely a coming conflict, let's put it that way, that's going to be emerging. And why I mentioned Chile is that, for example, BYD is actually open. So it's not here because this is EVs, but Chile is opening a refining facility in Chile. And of course, if Chile has a free trade agreement with the United States, and therefore that refined lithium would, in theory, qualify for tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. So that is obviously sort of creates some dilemmas for those who may not be those policymakers who see it as a problem that some of the the investments made in clean energy in the United States, which are and will benefit a lot of the manufacturing in the United States, some of those benefits may also flow to Chinese companies because Chinese companies are just so invested in this industry, and it's just very difficult, frankly, to make a low-cost battery without a Chinese company having touched at least one or component of that value chain. Now, other evidence for this is very preliminary, so we can talk about it. I don't have smoking gun, but I do think it's quite interesting that if you look at polysilicon exports from Germany, and there's one company in Germany that makes polysilicon. They've been exporting a lot of polysilicon to Vietnam. Now, who is making solar panels in Vietnam? Well, there's a lot of Chinese companies making solar panels in Vietnam, and having German polysilicon would theoretically allow these companies to show that they're compliant with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, the UFLPA. Which of course is targeted at production in Xinjiang, which is been linked to forced labor. And so I think this is just sort of an interesting example of something that would show, in theory, if this were true, it would show that actually the UFLPA has been quite effective in changing the supply chains and providing incentives for new types of production that are more compliant with human rights priorities in the United States. But the Chinese companies are the ones doing it. And the Chinese companies are still very much involved in the supply chain. And so I think it sets it up for some really interesting questions and discussions on what the priorities of the US government should be. So finally, I think should be clear. I talked about EVs because that's where a lot of my research lies, but also I think it's been very high profile. But this isn't just EVs, and it's not just the United States, right? So solar panels have been really high on the the agenda when in Secretary Yellen's visit in Beijing. In the European Union, you now have anti-subsidy investigations in high-speed rail, wind turbines, solar panels. There's a lot of concerns over hydrolyzers, heat pumps. And there's actually a lot of global South countries that are also exploring trade barriers at the same time as they're working to attract more of that Chinese investment. So that's an interesting dynamic that I think one will want to keep watching. I think I've been saying that this 2024 is the year of tariffs. I stand by it. I think we're going to continue to see more trade barriers being increased, but there's also beyond trade. I think there's new challenges for Chinese companies or for companies that have Chinese components, frankly. On the one hand, I think this is especially true in the United States. We see now more and more concern over the national security implications of data. And there is an ongoing investigation by the Department of Commerce in connected vehicles, the risks posed by connected vehicles made by Chinese companies or Chinese connected vehicles. Policymakers are still evaluating risk. We don't know what the final ruling is. They're still collecting comments, blah, blah, blah. But, this is indicative of the fact that this has now become a securitized environment. In the European side, something that's going to continue to be even more important for companies is actually proving and documenting their carbon intensity. This is going to matter for the battery production. CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, does not really apply to end products, but it does matter for a lot of commodities, which might, like steel, that might affect some things as well. There's, increasing talk about these types of carbon-based tariff mechanisms. There is one last issue, which I mentioned, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That's going to become, I think, a more and more important regulation. It's going to matter a lot more for the auto industry, for example. And so I think keep an eye on that, because I think companies are going to continue to have to find ways to comply with that. And that requires documenting your supply chain and knowing not just who your supplier is, but who your supplier is. And that's quite complicated, actually, especially when you're talking about mining in mining, which often happens in developed countries, which can be quite challenging to document. But I think it's actually a good trend that companies are paying more attention to where they're getting their products from. So that's all. And I think what I don't have here is exactly why the how to balance all of this. But I think this is a really big challenge. And I think underlying all of this is that essentially we need a lot of these technologies in order to make progress on climate targets. There is transportation is one of the most important sources of carbon emissions in the United States. So electrifying cars is sort of central to making progress on air pollution, but also on emissions. And so I think that leaves us in a very difficult position where you're seeing, on the one hand, tariffs and restrictions being placed on some of the technologies that are needed, but also the real need to diversify, because many of those technologies are highly concentrated in their production. And so I think that's just a trend to consider is the role of Chinese companies as they internationalize in all of this. I will stop here. I think I talked way longer than I even should have. And I look forward to questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's I can start with yeah, very good. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mazzocco, for a really wonderful presentation. And we already have one question from one of the audiences, so I'll read that out. So her question is, are EVs and clean tech really a security concern, or is this mostly about the U.S. wanting to promote its own companies? So kind of the protectionist kind of angle there. So yeah, well, what do you think about that?
I think it's a very valid question. And I think the answer is complicated. So I think it's valid to be concerned about potential weaponization of digitalized technologies, right? But I think, to be honest, many parts of our lives are becoming digitalized and data is collected everywhere. And so I think the reason why cars have become such a focus of the current concerns is likely because of the economic salience, right? It's on everybody's mind because of economic concerns. Therefore, we're also thinking a lot more about the security concerns. And so I don't mean to say that we shouldn't think about national security concerns, but I think there might be some qualifying elements there. And I think if I can just broaden it a little bit, I think this speaks also to the conflation that's happening of different understandings of risk. So I think there's very real and immediate economic risks that are due to this kind of competition. So employment is very significant, innovation, etc. And there, I actually think Chinese foreign direct investment can provide some solutions, right? So you can see the Japanese model where Japanese car makers in the 1980s started opening factories in the United States, became more American in some ways. American car makers became better because they adapted some of those new manufacturing techniques that Japanese companies came, and that sort of made everybody happy. Now, this was the result of like negotiated, protracted conflict, etc., but there was that pathway and solution. Now, if Chinese companies are a national security risk, that is off the table, right? So we have no solution that allows us to improve, sort of to take advantage of those, pre-competitive companies that, yes, they are highly subsidized. They have been highly subsidized over the past, but they've become pretty strong companies, and they do have a lot to offer and a lot to teach, actually. So I think that's really as I see it, one of the big conflicts right now is identifying exactly how much of a national security risk is it, and is there like a technical solution to some of this? And I think there are in many cases technical solutions, but I think the impulse right now is to have blanket bans because of that economic risk that is perceived to be sort of unsurmountable.
Oh, very good. Yeah, thank you. So I have one question related to the last question. I understand that Ford last year wanted to license some of the Chinese technology for electric batteries, but then the U.S. Congress said no. Even licensing the technology would be maybe a security risk, or at least something that we didn't want to do to cooperate with China. So, but do you think that could be maybe some sort of compromise that we rather than say importing Chinese electric batteries, we try to use some of the technologies and sort of have that kind of cooperation, but still keep the manufacturing and the technology on the US side of things?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, and that case was quite interesting. My understanding is actually that it's moving forward, but I may be wrong. If somebody has better information than me, there has not been a lot of news about that. That may be on purpose that they do not want too much attention. But it definitely was paused for quite a while, and it definitely received a lot of scrutiny. One of the Interestingly, one of the critiques was that there wasn't enough evidence of technology transfer, which is ironic for those who followed all the complaints over the years of U.S. companies being forced to transfer their technology. But I think that points to, yes, that potentially could be a model, right? You have partnerships, and that way, over time, presumably that might lead to some, if not necessarily technology transfer, some learning through that. I think that it is something to consider. I think especially in the battery industry, I think there's this interesting problem where, at the one hand, the U.S. government at the moment, the Biden administration, is trying to de-risk everything, right? And you understand, I get the impulse, right? You want to like build a completely American or friend-shored supply chain. But what's good for the automaker might not be good for the battery maker and vice versa. So actually, for the U.S. automakers, it might work to their advantage to have some of these Chinese battery makers being able to produce in the U.S. and be able to supply them. And there is no real well-established American battery maker. Essentially, right now we've seen a surge of investment thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of that is foreign direct investment from Japan, Korea, China to a certain extent. But there's also a lot of startups, and one would hope that some of them will grow. But there's no American champion that's being threatened here. So having access to some of this technology essentially is not really something that the U.S. has really excelled at producing at scale, could really be quite advantageous in some cases. There's, I think, a lot of questions over, how localized is the supply chain, how many local hires there are. There's a lot of things that would qualify this, but I think in general, I think this could be, beneficial in many cases.
Oh, very good. Let's see, we have another question. And so that one is, you said that there are possible factories that aren't in use to make more EVs. Do you believe it's because of low employment rate or scarcity in manufacturing? Like how we have a chip problem to complete manufacturing diesel cars and the Sulca cards, Suica cards for Japan, the cards that they use on the subway and for those kind of electronic kind of purposes.
Yeah, so right now the narrative is that part of the reason why we're seeing this surge in exports from China is because there's been overinvestment in the EV sector. There's a lot of Chinese companies, the EV companies, and therefore they've built too many factories, and those products need to go somewhere. We know this is probably the case in solar. There's evidence for this in solar. There's been overinvestment. There's a lot of huge factories. The International Energy Agency suggests that basically those Chinese factories could produce solar panels for everybody for decades to come, basically, right? For EVs, I think it's just a little more complicated because these are not a commodity product. So if you look at BYD, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that BYD factories are suffering from overcapacity. They're selling a lot of their vehicles, right? So they're making a ton of vehicles and they're selling them because there's a lot of demand for them. There certainly this might be happening for other cars, so it's hard to then calculate the aggregate. And so I'm very sympathetic to the fact that this is a complicated thing, and it may well be that there's overcapacity. Now, what I'm positing, and again, I don't have the data, but it's something to think about, is that there's also a lot of factories in China that don't make electric vehicles, but make internal combustion engine vehicles, right? And all those factories are actually the joint ventures between American or Western automakers and Chinese car makers. And so those factories have not, if they have not been refurbished or changed to produce EVs, if they're still internal combustion engine factories, those might be the ones where you actually end up having the overcapacity because Chinese consumers are buying fewer and fewer internal combustion engine vehicles relative to EVs, right? I'm not saying, actually, if you look at data, it's a pretty big market. They're still selling a ton of them. But like if you look into the future, this may be a looming issue. We do know that, and that data I showed, right? There's more and more internal combustion engine vehicles that are being sold. A lot of those are going to Russia. That's a particular situation because all of a sudden Western automakers had to pull out of Russia and they were replaced largely by Chinese automakers, but it's not all Russia. And that's the part that's interesting. It's also Mexico, for example. Mexico imports a ton of Chinese cars. Those aren't coming to the US. Those are actually, if you look at the top 10 cars sold in Mexico, a lot of them are Chinese. And so that's, I think, an interesting challenge and one that actually could have very negative climate implications because it could undermine electrification globally, right? So you see at the same time, China has the solution and the problem in many ways, which is often the case given China's size.
Very good, thank you. Another question from the audience. Could you talk more about why the US seems to be so behind? Is it really possible for the US to catch up?
Yeah, I mean, so the US never really there just wasn't a lot of investment in EVs, right? And so both in terms of having a market and the automakers. So what China did, which is more similar to what Europe did to a certain extent, was that the Chinese government started really working to create a market. It put out subsidies, equivalents of what our tax credits are now with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Where you can get like up to $7,500 every time for, when you buy a car, you can get a rebate of $7,500. So that lowers your upfront cost, right? So something very similar was done in China. It was very generous. It lasted for almost 10 years for private consumers. Initially, nobody was buying these cars, right? It was considered a failure. But they did it for taxi fleets, right? Bus fleets, which are huge in China. So, the car companies in China actually had somebody to sell. There was demand for these EVs that the government sort of helped create. And at the same time, China really has like a whole system set up to really benefit manufacturing. So there was just like a lot of a very positive environment for manufacturing, which includes also, a lot of banks providing lines of credit, investment from state-owned funds, et cetera. So there's a lot of sort of supportive, which are now the object of all these anti-subsidy investigations, right? That the accusation being that these might be distortive. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's a lot of the same things that are being now done in the United States were what China did for 10 years, right? So now we've done, in the United States, now it's been like a couple of years that we're testing these things out. It's likely, I would say, it's going to take time to catch up, right? In addition to all of that, American consumers tend to be skewed to these very heavy-duty pickup trucks, SUVs, et cetera, which are just harder to make as an electric vehicle, right? They're not buying, but American consumers are not used to buying these light-duty, small electric vehicles. And as a consequence, American automakers have not been trying to make these. So now if you look at the comparison of prices, often, they'll be in the news, they'll be, talking about like how the average car in China, I can't remember now what it was, the number was, but it was like less than $30,000. And the average car EV in the US is over 50,000, right? So you're like, oh, that's incredible. How is that possible? Well, it's also that the average EV sold in the US are these like big, heavy, fancy cars, essentially. Well, in China, it's these more smaller, compact cars. Now, of course, in China, you can find the whole gamut. BYD makes $200,000 cars and it makes $10,000 cars, right? So like you can really buy anything you want, but that's part of the difference, right? Is that these car makers in China are really competitive because they offer a lot more variety, while the US car makers do not. So I don't know if that answers your entire question, but it's a process, right? Now, for example, the Biden administration is really investing in charging infrastructure. That's going to be central to getting consumers to actually buy into this. And you've seen some hesitancy towards EVs more recently, but there's been much more enthusiasm towards plug-in hybrids, which suggests that people are concerned about charging. So that might change things as well.
Very good. Let's see. I had a sort of related question, I guess. I know Tesla has been very good at setting up charging stations, sort of proprietary ones. And so for the Tesla cars that are, say, exported to Europe, are they doing something similar to that they have their own charging stations that I guess maybe could affect other Chinese EV cars that, say, BYD ones that didn't have access to those charging stations? Do you know whether that has any effect on future trends?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not so sure. I don't know about that. I mean, I will say, I would say I think the average European who buys a Tesla probably doesn't know if it's made in China. And and now Tesla has a factory in Europe, so we might see a shift. But I think there's been a lot of challenges with that factory in Germany. There's some issues there as well. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that they do offer the charging, the home charging package in Europe as well. But yeah, I don't know how that plays into them versus Chinese car makers. I will say, BYD is just starting in Europe. Some have told me that they've been a little disappointed by their performance in Europe. It's very early on, and they don't have any brand recognition. So I would imagine it would take them a little bit. But they certainly have a pretty attractive product.
Yeah, and maybe just building on that, you mentioned about the brand recognition. I mean, do you think that's going to be a problem going forward with, say, quality control that Europeans, I mean, they know Tesla, right? And as you said, maybe they won't ask whether the Tesla was made in the US or Shanghai or in, I guess, Berlin is the new factory. But do you think that sort of going forward, the Europeans will say, oh, well, I don't really like my BYD or one of the other smaller EV makers, and so that the Chinese are kind of maybe jumping the gun a little bit with exporting to Europe before the quality is up to kind of the standards that European consumers want to see?
It's an excellent question. I don't, I think we'll have to wait and see. It might depend also on the market in Europe. I do think that's like gets to the what I think is really interesting is that these Chinese companies like BYD are becoming multinationals on this compressed, accelerated timeline. BYD, I showed the map, right? It has these, plans for all these factories that are going to be open in the next 2 years, basically. You have to imagine there's going to be a quality control challenge, right? If you think of the stories of Tesla when they were setting up the factories, there were multiple issues with quality control, right? So I just, I think when I was talking to somebody in the automotive industry, and they were like, when you open a new factory, there's always problems, right? As a consumer, you don't know it, but so I think BYD is going to be operating in multiple labor markets, multiple regulations, multiple consumer demands, etc. So I can imagine that there will probably be challenges. Now, whether that's a blip in a larger story of success or if that's what's going to bring them down, who knows, right? And I think we'll have to see how that compares to the experience of other Chinese automakers that are going to start producing abroad as well. BYD obviously being the largest, by far the largest EV maker in China. So I think they're kind of like Tesla in some ways, right? They're really unique, and also very vertically integrated like Tesla, which gives them a huge cost advantage. But again, makes it that it's all on them, right? They need to make from they have investments from the mining to the boats that carry the cars, right? So there's no excuses there with suppliers.
Well, again, I think just quickly, we have another question, but because I understand BYD makes their own batteries as well, whereas Tesla, I think, depends on outside suppliers, right, for their batteries. So
Yeah. I mean, I think they work with Panasonic to make their batteries or CATL in some cases, but yes, ultimately they don't capture that whole value added. So that's a bit different. And so I think, yes, nobody is as integrated as BYD because BYD started as a battery maker, right? So I think they have that key advantage, which has been really challenging for other legacy automakers to adjust to.
let's see. So we have another question from the audience. I'm interested in environmental issues. I heard that EVs aren't really that good for the environment because electricity still uses fossil fuels. Could you explain more about the impact on climate change?
I think there's at this point plenty of very rigorous research that shows that even if your grid is entirely running on coal, an electric vehicle is going to be less impactful than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that's just electricity is just more efficient also in terms of how it operates. And in most cases, you're not running, well, in the United States, certainly, our grid is not 100% coal. In many cases, it's becoming much cleaner. So that's also a thing. You buy an electric vehicle today, chances are that in 5 years, your grid is actually going to be cleaner and cleaner. And that's even the case in China, where yes, still the coal is still like a very significant part of the grid. Depending on where you are in China, you might be cleaner or dirtier, but the trajectory is for coal to be less important in the production of electricity. So I would, that's of interest. If you look at some of the major news outlets have published on this. Like I think if you look it up, there's pretty good evidence. Like good scientists have been doing this and running the tests. And but I do recognize that there are some environmental issues. That most of those have to do with mining. So I think that actually is the challenge of the future, is thinking more deeply about the impact of mining. Critical minerals are key to the production of a lot of this clean technology. And so I think, it will be really important to think of, first of all, responsible mining, right, both towards communities, towards environmental impact, et cetera. In many cases, this mining is happening in developing countries, which traditionally have not had as stringent of environmental standards. But I think also we should have more investments in technologies that use fewer minerals, maybe resources like sodium, which is less, more abundant also. And also recycling. So I think recycling is actually going to be a really important approach, which can help both reduce the national security issues linked to critical minerals, which of course create choke points, and also be really better from an environmental standpoint. The challenge is in the cost, right? So it's the same with the plastics, right? It's cheaper these days to make plastics from fossil fuels than it is from recycling a bottle. So most of the plastic that we recycle doesn't actually get recycled. It just gets burned, which is a tragedy. And so the same problem happens with minerals, where it is expensive to recycle. And so I think actually working more on that and research and making that happen is going to be a really important thing for the future.
Good. Yeah, I had let's see. We don't have a new one from the audience, but I had another question about sort of the political situation in the U.S. I think, you mentioned before the potential BYD factory in Mexico, which was part of the reason I think that former President Trump, right, a few weeks ago, that was part of his bloodbath, I think, comment that if the Chinese start, but it was really related to the auto industry, at least that's what he claimed. That if China was exporting so many EVs to the U.S., that would be this kind of disaster for the U.S. auto industry. And then he also said, if I understand correctly, if he were elected, he put 100% tariff on those kind of Chinese EV cars. So I'm wondering, what do you think going forward if Biden? So Trump, we don't really know what he would actually do. But do you think in the second Biden administration that the emphasis on environmental issues and expanding EV car use in the U.S. would lead Biden to have a softer stance on importing Chinese electric vehicles, or would he just continue the kind of restrictive policies that we have now?
I think the restrictive policies are going to continue. I think I don't see any interest in opening to Chinese EV exports from China. I think it's a little, when you get to the sort of components of batteries, et cetera, I think there's a little more openness to Chinese investments, Chinese companies. So if you read the foreign entity so for those who are not familiar, the Inflation Reduction Act, it includes these tax credits for batteries, and to qualify for a tax credit, your battery needs to be made following a certain set of requirements and in relation to where they're made, where the minerals are coming from, etc. Now, this would exclude foreign entities of concern. And the Treasury Department and the Energy Department have been put in charge of figuring out what that means. So essentially, there's been a guidance that was issued in December. We don't have the final guidance yet. We don't know when it's going to come out. But the draft one, at least, it included, of course, production in China. And then it included, limited how, it set a limit to how much, essentially, right? It was like the whole language had to do with control by Chinese state entities, etc. But essentially, it was a state-owned enterprise couldn't own more than 24% of a company that was a Chinese state-owned enterprise couldn't own more than 24% share of the entity that was producing the refined mineral or the cathode, the anode, the battery itself, right? So that has led to a big reshuffling of ownership, etc. But I think that recognized the reason they did that was that they recognized that this is a really complex supply chain, and that essentially if they said no Chinese ownership or no Chinese state ownership at all, the result would be that I think the number was like just 2 or 3 car models would qualify for those tax credits. So if you take too hard a line, then you make zero progress on climate change. But if you're too soft, your car makers are not going to be on board. You get, you're politically liable. And essentially, I think we need to remember that the Inflation Reduction Act has been this incredible regulation that's been the result of this coalition between very different forces. You had the labor movement, the environmental climate movement, and then you had sort of these national security elements, right? So if you think of Joe Manchin, that's sort of like what he was embodying, was this mix of sort of competitiveness, manufacturing, and anti-China sentiment in many ways. And that, I think, now puts the climate group, the climate people, in a very awkward position where, you need the support of labor and national security, but it's coming at higher and higher costs, which could eventually threaten the transition. But at the same time, everybody knows it needs to be politically sustainable. You want to create green jobs, etc. So it's this very difficult balance to get right.
Very good. See, there's another question from the audience. Are Chinese EV companies all owned by the Chinese government? How does the Chinese government influence what these companies do, besides giving them money through subsidies?
Excellent question. No, they're not all owned by the Chinese government. In fact, BYD, which is the company we keep coming back to, is a private company. It's a listed company. So Warren Buffett actually owned a 10% share at one point. I think they've sold some of it at this point, but so you could argue it was a little bit American in some ways, right? But I think it's actually some of the more dynamic auto companies in China are private. So you definitely see some state-owned companies that have made a lot of have had a lot of success abroad. SAIC is one of them. They own the MG brand. So one of the reasons they're so popular is that they have this legacy brand that they've reinvented as an EV company, right? MG never produced EVs, and so SAIC has just been using the brand, but it's really SAIC technology there. And that's owned by the Shanghai government, the SAIC. So it's a local state-owned enterprise. So there's a bit of a mixture there in terms of the profile of the companies. How does the Chinese government influence companies? That's the million-dollar question that everybody's trying to figure out, because that would be, the answer to everybody's national security concerns, is actually understanding. It's difficult to evaluate. So in some cases, there's regulation which suggests that companies would, in case of national security, would have to hand over, for example, data. But, if you talk to some companies, they say, well, we've never been asked to handle our data. It's hard to evaluate exactly how much that happens. There have been more and more efforts to include, party cells in companies. So, Chinese Communist Party, cells with it embedded in the company. Hard to say how much of that is just sort of performative or how much of that is actually influencing day-to-day company decisions. There has been increasing blurring of the lines between what is private and public, because increasingly their Chinese state-owned entities are taking stakes, so buying shares or creating joint ventures with private companies. So that makes it a little bit harder to actually disentangle whose interests are where. And that I think it's less of a national security issue than it is getting to this sort of economic fairness, right? Because obviously, if you have sort of a state-owned enterprise that's working with you, you're likely to be receiving more access to resources, if nothing else. And so that raises a lot of questions. So I guess I don't have a very clear answer, but I can tell you that nobody has a very clear answer on this.
No, I think that's about as clear an answer as we can get. So yeah, it's
Yeah. I see the next one, so I think I can on the climate groups coming together to create climate sustainable regulation for international companies. That would be wonderful. I think it's challenging. I think you see if it's non-governmental groups that come together, then it's not enforceable or it's hard to enforce. So I think you've seen a lot of challenges with ESG, standards, for example, that tend to be very voluntary and they're not very traceable, and there's a lot of challenges with that. And there's been a bit of a backlash actually towards that. I think when it's governmental, there's a lot of these political economy questions that come in the midst of it. So actually, European-U.S. relations on this have been very tense. There were real incentives to come to agreement on steel and aluminum. So the idea is that the U.S. and Europe would come up with standards for green, sustainable aluminum and steel, and then they could have a joint market, and that would be great from an economic security standpoint because it would cut off China essentially, but also great for the climate and environment because steel and aluminum are highly polluting, so that would be really positive. It has been extraordinarily challenging, and it's those talks have essentially stalled. We've seen very little progress. It's been, I think, very frustrating on both sides, but I think especially on the European side, in part because Europe already has very advanced standards of this, because Europe has a carbon market, while the United States does not. So in many cases, the US is lacking the data. And so now there's been an effort within the government to collect that data. But many, and I'm not an expert on this, but many have argued that the US should just adopt the European standards, but that, the United States resists that because, the United States doesn't want to adopt another country's standard. So I think it just points to the fact that even when it's a close security ally like the European Union, there's these economic challenges that make it very hard to come to certain types of agreements. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying and coming up with these ideas. I think they're really powerful ideas, and I think more pressure on government to make progress on this will be beneficial.
very good. Let's see. There aren't any other questions. Maybe we just have a couple of minutes left. Maybe just one last question, just since you mentioned the European issues. I mean, do you think that Europe is opening themselves up to security risk by accepting so many Chinese electric vehicles? In contrast, as you say, to the U.S., which is keeping out virtually all Chinese electric vehicles. Is Europe maybe taking too big a risk, or maybe is the benefit to them outweighing that kind of risk?
I think we'll see a reversal of some of that, because I'm pretty confident we'll see tariffs being announced in the next few months. Right now, though, but the tariffs wouldn't block all exports. I think, the objective is my understanding based on conversations I've had with officials, European Union officials, is, they recognize that now it's, about 10% of all EVs sold in Europe are Chinese made, and that's fine. They just don't want it to completely, it's grown so fast in the past 2 years that, they don't want it to grow to like 70% in another 2 years, right? And so I think the goal is to sort of slow it down rather than block it completely. Now, I think what is going to be a likely outcome, and I think we're already seeing this a little bit, is that Chinese companies are going to invest more in Europe. And if you look at the battery industry, I had a report that came out in December, and Colin and I tried to calculate how many of the battery factories in Europe were Chinese, and about 10 to 12%, I think, were Chinese owned. Sorry, 12% of the battery manufacturing capacity was Chinese owned. And if all projects, and that's obviously not going to be true, but if all projects that have been announced were to come online, it would grow to about 24%. So not enough to be, not enough to say they're completely taking over the battery industry in Europe, but enough that one would say, well, they're making a difference and it's going to be important. And in some countries, it's going to be way more important than others, right? Like Hungary, which is going to house this massive CATL factory. So I think that's going to be the trend. And so I think there's the question, right, which we already posed, which is, what does it mean to have a Chinese-owned factory in your own country? And I think there's a lot of benefits, but certainly there's some security risks that countries are opening themselves to as well. And so I think they'll have to balance that and think about it and evaluate.
Very good, thank you. Well, we're pretty much out of time for this afternoon. So I'd like to thank Dr. Mazzocco for a really enlightening presentation, also for the audience questions. And I think we all learned a lot today. So thank you very much, Dr. Mazzocco, for taking time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Dr. Harwit, and thank you all for hosting me. It's been great talking to you.